welcome to the festival, Reena. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Catherine?
Oh, I'm good and all the better for chatting to you today. What a great conversation we're going to have. Thank you for joining me. And I think the best place for us to start is if you wouldn't mind talking the audience through what you do at Nestle.
So I am a legal business partner servicing a region of 23 countries in East and Southern Africa. Um, I'm also an advocate for diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and as such, I'm extremely passionate about influencing a positive culture change in the region. But my primary roles, or maybe niche roles, I'm not sure which is a better way to put it, are actually as the region's compliance lead and also as the data protection officer.
Excellent, exciting stuff for
Hmm.
sure. And I mean, so relevant now as well. And I think it's probably fair to say that data privacy has been in the front of many people's minds since the rise of, GDPR and such like, depending on where you are around the world. Obviously, this is a global festival, so depending on where you are, that would be called something different. But with the rise of these regulations, as I mentioned, I think it's fair to say that data privacy has certainly been front of mind. Now, something that we've spoken about before is that there's a bit of a difference between knowledge and awareness, and we're going to dive into that a bit today. But start me off with where you think people's knowledge is of the regulations that are there, and what this means in reality for people, in your opinion.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, we've spoken about this previously. There has been, as you mentioned, a lot of conversation around the GDPR, around privacy, especially since the GDPR was released in 2018 and was made effective. I mean, privacy has been on the forefront. But in my opinion, we're aware that a regulation exists, whether we're talking about GDPR or in other countries, we're just talking about, a right to privacy. Let's just put it very simply. I mean, the right to privacy obviously is in pretty much every constitution across the world. There are obviously some notable exceptions, which I can't name off the top of my head. So it's not like it's a new right, but the GDPR really did it changed things. And it really made people a lot more aware of how data is being used. And legislators are obviously putting out regulations, as you mentioned, but we're still stuck at that point where it's awareness, but not necessarily knowledge. Um, there is a right, but the confusion exists between the right that exists, i.e., I can say, no, I don't want to share my information, but not necessarily the understanding that data privacy regulations actually only protect the processing of personal data. Um, it's 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 synonymous with other rights, that whether it's a right to confidentiality, whether it's a right to intellectual protection, rights protection, etc. Um, but I mean, intellectual property rights, but it's protecting personal data. But the issues that I see are people fail to understand what the definition is as well. What is personal data? They almost want to just quote that right sort of openly to cover all sorts of information,
Mm.
and just say, oh no, I can't share that with you. I have a right to privacy. And then and then they don't also understand the exceptions or the exclusions under which they actually have to share that personal information. So maybe there is a right that exists, but then there are exclusions that are stated under the law. So that's where I feel that there's a bit of a confusion. um, I think I, I think even on an organizational side, there's a massive panic about privacy, and I mean, and the panic is actually is very much stemmed in the fact that the sanctions or the penalties are so extremely high. Um, and regulators are very keen to find that organization and make that mark, and um, set an example out there, that this
Mm.
is what you're not supposed to do. But unfortunately, as a result, organizations may also themselves internally not know. They may be aware, but they may not know how to practically apply this.
And that's exactly what I wanted to tease out of that, because instantly you went for the example there of, I don't need to share this data with you, but I've certainly seen it in the community where it's a case of, I can't collect this data, like absolutely hands off. And it's really interesting, in your intro there you were talking about your passions for diversity and inclusion, because I think that's such a great example of where people get really frightened really quickly as soon as
Yeah.
you start talking about that personal data. A lot of organizations won't touch it, even though we know there is a huge benefit to collecting. At the end of the day, we
Yes.
care about what we measure. And it teased that out for me a little bit more as well. In your experience with organizations, having that understanding between confidential data, personal data, and then what we can actually do versus the kind of broad brush, we're just not going to touch it.
Um, so so there's actually been, in terms of confidential. Let me indirectly just respond to your question, and kind of take you back to also diversity and inclusion as well. And just generally the discussion around personal data. So the discussion at the time um, that we globally experienced a full lockdown across the world because of COVID, you can imagine how the right to personal data really became a very interesting discussion, because here are organizations who are trying to return to some sort of normalcy. And so they are trying to have people return back to the office, but then they can't also expose their employees to the risk of having catching COVID. So here they want to they want to ask for information which actually would be protected under the act. So under whatever we call GDPR or POPI in South Africa, or the Data Protection Act in Kenya, etc. So how regulators were also stumped. How do you manage this? What kind of information can we allow them to ask? Under what right do we allow organizations to have this information? And then how is it going to be allowed to be shared across the organization, etc.? So that was a really interesting challenge, where you've got actually beautiful example of a synonymous relationship between confidential and personal data. Um, and then you've got other examples where organizations, and Nestle is trying to do this. I believe Coca-Cola is trying to do this. I think there's loads of multinationals are trying to address the gap in diversity within their organizations. But how do you address the gap in organizations when gender, or when your abilities, whether you're differently abled or any disability? I'm trying to be politically correct here, but also grammatically. How do you address those elements when you're an organization, and when you know this is a protected right, and people have the right to say, no, I don't want to provide that. So they want diversity. We want to have more representation in boardrooms, but then we don't want to share the information. um, and then I think what's amazing is the right protected under these regulations has actually um, brought security requirements and strict security requirements to the forefront. And I think that's one beautiful element, but these come at a huge cost.
Mhm.
And I'm happy I'm happy or for the business to actually err on the side of personal data, so that then I can actually work with them and then say, no, this is confidential data and this is personal data, so you can treat this confidentially, for example. um, but I'm also happy to say, okay, fine, you know what, the security levels that you can provide under privacy, like as a private or sensitive information. They're super amazing for protecting all kinds of sensitive information, whether it's confidential or not. But it's not realistic for all organizations. Smaller organizations can't afford this. I've noticed even with our relationships within Nestle, when we're entering into discussions with suppliers on their services, some service providers actually tell us that we cannot provide this level of security because, one, also in Africa, the other issue is that we don't have all the countries fully. I mean, they may have a regulation, like Kenya has a regulation. They have now, the regulation was effective in 2019. They've got now, a commission in place, but do they have that level of policing by the regulators? And is it actually a question of policing, or is it a question of trying to understand what the regulation is, and work together with organizations? But I mean, that's a totally different topic now. Yeah, so it's a very interesting, regulation and requirement under the regulation. It's amazing. I'm very happy with the security levels that are required, but they're not always feasible for the smaller organization. And if we're going to try and bring up the smaller organizations, not create a greater divide again, then how are we going to help? Whether we or the community at large, how do we create, one, that awareness and that knowledge in these smaller organizations, but also help them to comply? I'm lucky. I work with an organization who can afford to protect personal data of their consumers, their employees, at that kind of a level, and heavily invest in such securities. And it's actually part of their commitment, because Nestle does want to ensure that any employee, any supplier, any customer, any consumer, any stakeholder is assured that and can trust the organization. But that trust, unfortunately, sometimes it's not possible to and I guess it's earning that trust as well, because you have to pay for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you touched upon the difference between what a small organization and such a large organization where you come from, because in the audience we have exactly that. We have some very small companies to the very, very large enterprise levels. And I think this is something that impacts us all. But also, as you mentioned there's so many threads to this tapestry when it comes to data privacy and regulation that, I mean, we could literally fill an entire festival with it, Reena, for sure. And I'm keen, when we go down this path, it can often end up being quite a negative conversation or an overwhelming conversation. I'm keen for us to switch it up a little bit and maybe talk about some of the things that you have seen that have worked well. So, for example, have you seen any training or things that have worked well to enable organizations, to enable teams to understand the differences between what we've been speaking about today?
So you actually make a very, very, I mean, that's a brilliant question. You make a very good point. Training is extremely key. The GDPR, and I think the GDPR, the brilliance behind it is that it's trying to inculcate a privacy by design principle, and so training is key for that. Before I explain what I think an effective training is, I would probably want to also talk about what a ineffective training is, which I have seen. I've seen ineffective trainings where it's a training where you're talking almost at people. It's a generic training. It's just like, this is the law, this is what you need to do, go for it. And privacy is a kind of thing which, well, I think actually compliance is moving. The whole GRC function, the practitioners are actually moving to a compliance by design function as well, or way of working. It's because if you want to be trusted. You need to, and then I keep going back to this word trust, you need to inculcate a culture. And the culture can only happen if people know practically how to apply the regulations. It's not about rote learning. Catherine, I can send you a whole bunch of definitions to memorize. And I love that in law schools, yes, they do help you by telling you, okay, you need to know this, this, and this, but that's the basics. At some point, as you graduate through the years in law school, they now start to try and get you to think independently. And as you continue to grow in your experience, you actually, and I can tell you this from my own personal experience, the way I would address the law when I first graduated is very different to the way I address my legal work now. I mean, I now see myself, and that's why I said I'm a legal business partner for Nestlé across the East and Southern African region, because you cannot act as just a lawyer who advises. You need to be able to be part of the solution. You need to understand what the organization wants and how you're going to help them reach their end goal. So a generic training is not going to help. I think it has to be a functional specific training. You need to sit with your functions, understand what the function is trying to accomplish, and as a result, build a training module or modules that work towards those towards those functions, so that they can understand, they can take this home and apply, well, back to their office and apply. But actually, speaking of home, one of the things that I really like to do is be very transparent and sort of scare the the trainee into thinking that this breach impacts them personally. Like,
Mm,
say, look, what happens if this information is exposed and it's hacked? Like, what if we're hacked tomorrow and you've asked for unnecessary information, or the purpose is over, et cetera, et cetera? I mean,
mm,
and in those situations, if the moment you start explaining to them the various types of risks, it's amazing. There's sort of this inbuilt fear that, okay, I now understand what the law is trying to protect. Now it makes them think when they're actually applying, they're when a marketer is, for example, doing a promotion, they start to think on the other side of the fence, what is it that the data subject is going to be concerned about? Is the data subject going to be concerned in this way or that way? And then as a result, they can actually build their promotion accordingly. So yeah, so functional trainings are very, very key. Visual aids, I really like videos, and I think repeat sort of videos with and quizzes. Quizzes are brilliant. It creates a competitive environment,
mhm.
especially if you can give like some sort of nominal gift, but it creates that environment that get people thinking. And repeat these, do these, make it exciting. Most people think compliance is boring, and I can tell you, I mean, I sound excited about it, but then I can tell you, my brother, he's just like, oh, why do you? I mean, you're a lawyer. It's such a boring profession, And then he starts hearing me talk like this, and he's just like, you're so passionate. You're the biggest nerd I know.
But that's exactly it, right? It's about taking something that could be very, very dull. And it's about, as you mentioned, thinking on the other side of the business, how can you engage busy people who've got jobs to be
Yes.
expert and great at? How can you bring them into your world for however long that may be and how regular that may be as well, and engage them in a way? And I love the fact that you draw on the fact that you're making it personal to them, what matters to them and their goals, and applying that to it, as opposed to having a very standard way of training, a standard way of talking about something that's broad brush across the entire business, which may engage a minority, but maybe not the
Yeah.
majority. So I
Yeah.
absolutely love that. Now, we've only got a few minutes left
Ooh.
together, Reena, for today. What would be your top tip if you're thinking about the audience taking away one top tip from our conversation today? What would that be?
So we already spoke about training, and I think that's already covered. I would say my absolute top tip is appointing Spocks. You know, i- if you're going to be successful as a data practitioner, a data privacy practitioner, it's imperative for you to have eyes and ears on the ground. You cannot be everywhere. Having a Spock helps you to build that culture from the different functions internally. Um, and training that Spock actually helps I guess it's one, it helps people within the functions keep privacy always at the forefront of their minds because they're talking about it, they're thinking about it. But then it also means that you have a little bit of time to, to address real issues. So having a Spock to act as your eyes and ears within the functions, it's just I just cannot recommend this enough. I mean, it really allows you as an officer to strategically help the business grow, because most of us organizations, especially since COVID, we're reaching out and interacting with our consumers, mostly on a virtual digital sort of basis. So having a Spock allows you to help that the organization, especially with first party data gathering, and that's I think that's the direction that most organizations are going. So yeah, I just, that's one of my top tips. The other thing is just continue communicating, and as a practitioner, you need to be much more approachable. You need to create that open door policy, and just so people are not afraid because they hear the sanction. They're actually afraid more. Or rather, they're not afraid. They're actually just happy to talk about it, and they're interested to know. So, yeah, just be approachable and happy, and yeah.
Amazing. Reena, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute treat. And I look forward to catching up with you very soon.
Thank you so much. You take care.